There was a case I thought I would have solved in a matter of days, but a small document forgotten in the file changed everything I thought I knew. What seemed like an accidental death ended up being the key to uncovering a much deeper and darker truth. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. My name is Esteban Mendez. I am a forensic doctor, and I have been working for over 20 years in Guadalajara, Mexico. Throughout my career, I have seen cases that defy logic and others that seem simple at first glance, but this one was undoubtedly the most revealing. It all started with a report of a supposed fatal fall. A man in his 40s found dead in a vacant lot near the Santiago River. The scene showed no obvious signs of violence, so the initial hypothesis pointed to an accident. However, something about that case kept me alert from the beginning. The body showed mild bruises, but the pattern did not fit a simple fall. Added to that was the incomplete story of witnesses who appeared nervous, and a file with incomplete documents and unclear dates. But the final piece came when I found a forgotten document, a handwritten note, barely visible among the pages of the initial report. That small paper not only clarified contradictions, but revealed details that no one had considered. A name, a date, and a specific time that challenged the official version. It was a turning point that led me to reevaluate all the evidence and discover a pattern that implied something more serious than an accident. At that moment, I understood that in forensic medicine, it is not enough to observe the obvious. You have to know how to read what is hidden in documents, in the silence of the victims, and in the way information is presented, often incomplete. The body can speak, but when combined with the story and the records, the truth is revealed. This case not only corrected a factual error, but changed the way I approach every investigation ever since. I realize that patience and attention to the smallest details are as vital as any laboratory analysis. Join me, because I will tell you how that forgotten document changed everything, and what consequences resolving the mystery behind that death had. I promise that what you are about to hear will make you see forensic medicine from a different perspective. When I opened the file, I expected to find routine data, simple analyses, and tests that would corroborate what was already anticipated. The case seemed straightforward. A man found lifeless in his apartment, with no obvious signs of external violence, apparently a heart attack. But something about the way the initial procedures had been carried out made me frown. There weren't many witnesses. The family seemed distant, and there were details in the statements that didn't quite add up. Still, the initial report was clear: natural death. My daily routine led me to meticulously review every sheet, studying every detail of the body, every toxicological analysis, every medical report, and every witness account. It was while examining an apparently secondary folder, a section of attached documents the previous expert had labeled as irrelevant, that I found something peculiar. A forgotten document, almost relegated to oblivion, nearly invisible among so many papers. It was a handwritten letter, dated a couple of weeks before the body was found. At first, I didn't give it much importance, but something about it pushed me to read it carefully. The letter was addressed to someone I barely recognized at first, with cryptic, worried text, and at the same time laced with a certain veiled fear. The sender spoke of threats, suspicions about someone close, and mentioned a situation that could affect the recipient's life. What caught my attention strongly was that the letter spoke of a key witness who had disappeared just after being interviewed by the police. Something didn't fit at that moment. Why had no one included that detail in the report? Why had no one explored the connection between that letter and the case? I decided I had to investigate further and began to draw connections. I reviewed every point, every piece of data, and started to assemble a new puzzle. The body showed no bruises, true, but the blood test revealed extremely subtle traces of a substance that hadn't appeared in the initial toxicological exams. A rare poison, difficult to detect, that could go unnoticed if the lab wasn't specifically prepared to look for it. I remembered that letter and the implicit fear of someone dangerous, and the picture began to fit together. Could it be that the man had been poisoned just before his heart failed, and that the whole scene had been carefully staged to make it look like a natural cardiac arrest? My intuition led me to take new samples, search for other chemical profiles, and request specialized analyses. The deeper I delved, the more convinced I became that something big was behind this seemingly ordinary case. The handwriting in the letter could be the key piece that unlocked everything, an indirect testimony that had gone unnoticed until then. And just when I thought everything was starting to make sense, I received calls from the police team, uneasy because some witnesses had changed their statements. The tension rose, as if someone was worried that the true causes would be uncovered. I began to receive whispered warnings, even anonymous messages urging me to back off. I knew I was on the right track, but also that I was treading on dangerous ground. That very night, I returned to morgue to examine the body more closely. I had to find physical proof, something tangible, conclusive. Patience did its work. Minute by minute, I observed the cold skin, the organs showing marks invisible to the naked eye, until I found microscopic signs in the liver, chemical traces that did not correspond to any common toxin. There was a poison, hidden, silent, deadly. It was the proof I needed to question the entire initial report. The next day, reorganizing the documentation, I reread the letter. That phrase which had seemed confusing before took on a new meaning. Watch what you say. Not everyone around you is who they appear to be. And then I understood that this forgotten document had not only revealed the poison, it had uncovered a web of lies and betrayals they had wanted to hide from us. Slowly, I began to piece together the new version of the case. Every step, every discovery, was stripping away the truth. Someone close to the deceased had manipulated the scene to make it look like an accident, so justice would be misled, and the hidden truth in those tiny details would never be discovered. And I held in my hands the key to change everything. What seemed a simple diagnosis of natural death had turned into a true mystery, demanding not only scientific rigor, but also intuition and courage. And as I reviewed that evidence, I understood that forensic medicine doesn't just work with bodies, but with stories, with secrets that need time to be revealed. I will never forget how a small piece of paper left to the side revealed much more than data, unmasked intentions, and taught me that the work of forensic expert is not just a technical job, but a constant search for the truth, even when everything seems to say otherwise. That case not only marked my career, but reaffirmed something fundamental. We must never underestimate the details others consider insignificant, because there, in the seemingly trivial, may lie the true story that changes everything. As I finished writing my new report, I knew that this piece had delayed justice, but also that my patience and persistence in seeking the truth had ensured the story was told as it really was. And although the body is silent forever, its secrets always find someone who listens closely. The lessons I learned in that case stay with me every day in the lab, because in my profession, patience and observation not only save my credibility, but lives, truths, and above all, justice. After confirming the presence of poison through specialized analyses, I felt I was at a crucial point in the case, as if every piece of that puzzle was beginning to fit. But the final twist was still missing, the one that would confirm not only the what, but the who and the why. I knew I held something much bigger than a simple misdiagnosed natural death. I was facing conspiracy that had worked hard to disguise the truth, trying to bury it in papers, confusing statements and intentional silences. The letter, so simple in appearance, had been the spark that ignited a flame no one else had seen burning. I then decided not to limit myself to the bodies and physical evidence. I began to talk to those who had been close to the deceased, reconstructing conversations, reactions, and gestures. It wasn't easy. It seemed as if a veil covered everything, and everyone was careful not to speak clearly. The family, for example, showed the typical facade of sadness, but beneath that sadness I sensed tensions and secrets. Someone was always trying to hide something, and in those small behaviors, I began to see a pattern. They weren't coincidences, but strategies to divert attention. Some witnesses who initially had been helpful now seemed regretful what they had said. Others simply disappeared or gave ambiguous explanations. It was in one of those encounters that a woman, a close friend of the deceased man, broke down. She confessed that shortly before dying, he had started suspecting someone very close, and that shortly after sending that letter, he had received veiled threats. Her voice trembled as she told me how he wanted to go to the police, but something or someone had stopped him. She spoke to me about unexplained change schedules, anonymous messages, and suspicious meetings. I realized the web woven around this death was far more complex than a simple medical event. The most unsettling came when I gained access to the building security footage, something that initially seemed routine, but the images showed something no one had noticed. A person entering the apartment a few hours before the body was found. Someone who had not been mentioned in any statements and who barely fixed their gaze, as if hiding a secret too big. That unknown figure, with a hurried and nervous pace, was the piece that confirmed my suspicions. It was clear proof that the scene had been staged, that this was not a random or natural death. It was an orchestrated death. But still, I was missing something. A motive, a clear reason, a connection that demanded justice. Without those elements, everything remained mere conjecture. Then, while reviewing documents I thought I had already studied, I found a pattern in the deceased's financial movements. Large sums had been withdrawn from his account in the days prior, transactions that did not match his history. It was evident that someone was behind this, someone trying to erase traces, or perhaps prepare an escape. When I confronted the family with this data, the atmosphere changed. From cold distance, they shifted to furtive glances, uncomfortable silences, and even veiled threats. There was no turning back. I began to understand that the poison was just the tip of the iceberg. There were hidden ties, perhaps debts, maybe entanglements with powerful people, or hidden interests. The man's death had been designed not just to silence him, but to protect much darker secrets. And as I delved into every detail, they also began to pressure me. Threats, once subtle, became direct. I received messages ranging from warnings to clear attempts at intimidation. But the conviction that I had to get to the bottom of it would not let me stop. One night, while reviewing the material one last time in the autopsy room, I felt a presence. I was not alone. Someone entered without permission, someone who seemed to want to intimidate me or possibly erase evidence. I had no time to react, but at that moment I knew my discovery had made those involved nervous. That tangible tension strengthened my determination to continue. If someone was working so hard to hide the truth, it was because its importance was greater than it seemed at first glance. By then, I understood this investigation required much more than a forensic examination. It required courage, and I decided to return to the letter. I spent hours contemplating each word, each line, as if unraveling its deep meaning would lead me to the final key. Every paragraph spoke to me of a silent conspiracy, of fear and strategy to survive a storm that seemed inevitable. I then discovered that the sender of that letter had mysteriously disappeared after the death, reinforcing the idea that whoever was behind it believed the truth had to die with those two people. The next day, hoping to find that piece, I reviewed data on missing persons, intercepted conversations, and police records again. Something was calling at my door. A young woman who had been close to both the deceased man and the letter's sender had key information. When talking to her, she broke down in tears, telling how she had testified against a powerful figure involved in the case, someone who used their position to manipulate situations and people, and how that had put her in the spotlight. She confirmed my suspicions. It was not only a murder disguised as a natural death, but was immersed in a network of corruption and abuse of power. Now I had to be even more careful. I knew we were on minefields, and that every new step brought me closer to people used to operating in the shadows, where the law was a flexible concept. But my training always reminded me that justice is a beacon. Even if the night darkens, it can always shine. I then reviewed the laboratory results with a new focus. In the traces of poison, I found something unexpected, a very rare chemical component, coming from a plant that can only be found in certain regions and especially known for being used in subtle forms of poisoning. That opened another front in the case, tracing the origin of that substance. The investigation led me to a small clandestine workshop where I was able to confirm the substance had been obtained illegally and was linked to certain underworld actors but with connections to powerful people. By intertwining that information with statements and financial movements in the victim's last days, an even darker narrative began to take shape. The man was trying to get out of a risky business, probably pressured by that criminal network, and poison was the method to silence his intention. The forgotten document not only revealed the murder, but also the existence of a criminal plot that would otherwise have remained hidden behind fabricated reports and convenient statements. What impacted me most was realizing that the initial file had been manipulated, not only in the facts but in how it was handled. Doors were closed, studies denied, Subtle clues, ignored simply to avoid unsettling certain groups. It was an ethical and professional catastrophe. But fortunately, there were still those of us who could reconstruct that lost path, even if slowly. This made me reflect that in our field, we face not only death, but also the invisible lives fighting for justice beyond the corpse. The next step was to gather all the evidence and prepare a new report, one that clearly showed each error, each omission, and above all, every hidden truth. But it was not easy. The pressure increased, and so did the threats. Someone did not want that document to see the light again. More than once I felt watched, as if ready to stop the investigation by any means. It was a mental, emotional, and physical battle, but I knew turning back meant losing the very vocation that had driven me to study forensic medicine, defending the truth, protecting those who could no longer raise their voices. When I finally delivered that corrective report, with proof of poisoning, the witness's disappearance, and the criminal connections, I discovered something even stranger: the mixed reaction of those who received it. On the one hand, the system began to respond, leading to a formal reopening of the case and the search for those responsible. But on the other hand, I also sensed I was provoking an institutional earthquake, powerful people moving pieces to keep everything in slow motion, lost in endless bureaucracy. The struggle was only beginning. And while all this was happening, I thought of that man, his letter, his fear, how a forgotten document, lost among thousands of papers, had the power to change a story and demand justice where it seemed impossible. For me, it was a harsh proof that in our work, it is not enough to look at the obvious. Many times the truth is hidden in details that go unnoticed. That patience, persistence, and courage can open doors where others see only walls. That case taught me that forensic science is much more than a set of techniques. It is a dance with uncertainty that demands both intelligence and heart, and that in the end, even though the body is forever silent, its secrets remain, waiting to be heard by someone willing to look beyond. Because in the search for truth, every small document, every trace, and every minute of attention can be the key to changing the course of a life and also the course of justice. And so, while I continue my work every day in the morgue, that forgotten document remains the most powerful reminder of why I do what I do. A reminder that, although the path is arduous and dangerous, it is always worth searching, because within the truth lies not only death, but also the hope and justice we owe to those who can no longer defend themselves. The pressure became more palpable with each passing day. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but there was something inside me, a mix of responsibility and a silent pact with those bodies that could not speak, that pushed me to keep investigating, to not give up. I couldn't settle for just the obvious, because in this case, the obvious was merely a disguise. What truly mattered was hidden behind layers of well-crafted lies, and every layer I peeled back brought me closer to an outcome that could change many things, but also put me in a vulnerable position. The meetings with the investigators assigned to the case became tense. Some seemed interested in moving forward, in seeking justice, but others showed a reserved, almost evasive attitude. On more than one occasion, I caught glances sliding toward me, trying to gauge my limits. I encountered subtle warnings disguised as recommendations not to get too involved, to protect my career, and not to stir up too much dust. But it wasn't just bureaucracy or protocol that unsettled me. It was a certainty that much greater powers were pulling the strings from the shadows, and they didn't hesitate to use any means necessary to protect themselves. The poison I discovered in the body had not only ended a life, but was also being used to intimidate those seeking the truth. Nevertheless, my mind remained clear. I repeatedly dwelled on the evidence. The letter, the recording with that unknown figure, suspicious financial transactions, altered behavior patterns in those surrounding the victim. There was something undeniable in all of it, those small details that, together, formed a story of betrayal, fear, and silence. During those weeks, I established a ritual. At night, I reviewed and scrutinized every page of the case file, every testimony, even the blurry security footage. In the mornings, I visited the morgue, observed, took notes, spoke with discreet colleagues, those few who share my concern and dare to question the official narrative. Meanwhile, the case began to take on a life of its own on social media and local news, thanks to a troublesome journalist who had managed to capture attention with an anonymous complaint pointing to irregularities in the initial autopsy. This was both a blessing and a threat. On one hand, it increased pressure on those in charge of the case, forcing them to take action. On the other hand, it also put the spotlight back on me. I began to feel watched, as if at every corner someone was waiting for my mistake, my downfall, but it was a risk I had accepted from the start. One afternoon, while consulting files at the Central Forensic Medicine office, I received a call I still remember clearly. On the other end, a distorted, clearly nervous and hurried voice warned me to leave the case alone, that certain people were not willing to allow me to continue uncovering what was there. No names were mentioned, but the tone left no doubt. A countdown had begun. Despite the fear, I responded with the only truth I could hold on to, that I would not stop until justice was served. That call was not the only one. More came, encrypted messages and emails with veiled threats. I faced an invisible, powerful enemy, armed only with evidence and conviction. Amid that storm, an unexpected figure emerged to give everything a sudden turn, a person who had remained hidden in the case and with whom no one had managed to connect. The deceased man's driver and personal assistant. At first, his interviews were vague. He was scared and seemed to avoid giving details. But when I realized that the key to moving forward was to earn his trust, I changed tactics and started sharing information already in the file, showing him I wasn't an adversary, but someone seeking to protect what he had also witnessed. Slowly, his words began to fill the gaps in the story, describing clandestine meetings, financial pressures, and moments when the victim appeared visibly disturbed and paranoid. What the driver revealed was a direct blow to the official narrative. He confessed that weeks before the incident, the deceased had received a multi-million-dollar bribe offered to stop investigating certain illegal activities linked to figures with political and criminal power. The victim's refusal had unleashed a series of events that ended in death. And the most serious thing, said the driver, was that all of this was supported by a group in charge of maintaining order in the shadows, using methods like intimidation and, when necessary, lethal violence. This confirmed my suspicions. The death was not an isolated act. It was a message directed at those who dare to challenge that corrupt system. With this new information, I not only had the strongest motive, but also confirmation that the investigation needed to take a completely different direction from what bureaucracy was trying to impose. It was crucial to protect the driver, who now, more than a mere source, represented a vulnerable witness in a story full of risks. I secured that conscious authorities involved in the case would allocate resources to implement protective measures, but I knew it wasn't enough. The tentacles of corruption were vast and even penetrated those bodies that intended to administer justice. Meanwhile, the chemical evidence remained a crucial point. I returned several times to the lab, reviewing every detail of the poison and its specific compounds with the specialists. Beyond the illegal origin of the substance, something caught my attention. A small, almost imperceptible seal on the chemical products used that indicated a particular manufacturer. This mark seemed linked to a private laboratory that, according to official records, had closed years ago due to irregularities in handling controlled substances. But when cross-checking data with federal investigators, a troubling lead emerged. That laboratory was still operating clandestinely, supplying certain criminal networks and shielded by corrupt officials. That discovery led me down a path I had so far avoided. The world of local drug traffickers and their connections with politicians and influential businessmen. It was not just a strange death. It was a tip of more complex network intertwining illegal businesses, money laundering, and abuses of authority. The deeper I dug, the tighter my surroundings became, the space to act shrank, but clarity increased. I had to make the invisible visible, break that pact of silence with concrete, demonstrable facts. The letter I found at the start was no longer an isolated spark, but the fire needed to light the way. For weeks, I maintained an almost obsessive routine. I didn't leave a single fact or doubt unattended. I met with friends, colleagues, and trusted sources to cross-check every detail. Every conversation, no matter how trivial it seemed, was a fundamental piece. Sometimes I thought how all this could seem like a story taken from a novel, but no, it was reality. And a painfully unfair reality. The victim, who now seemed to have a human face and a story full of fear and courage, had been victim not only of death, but of a system willing to silence any uncomfortable voice. The days became a mosaic of clandestine meetings, encrypted emails, and documents passed hand to hand. In one such moment, I received an unmarked envelope containing recent photographs of the building where the deceased lived. The images showed new surveillance stations, cameras placed at strategic points, and even suspicious paint stains on certain old cameras, as if someone had tried to sabotage footage on key days. I understood that someone was trying to control the narrative even from the physical space, manipulating visual evidence to protect the guilty. That act reaffirmed two things for me. First, that I was not alone in this fight. There were people inside the system and even outside who trusted me to restore the truth. And second, that the personal cost of this battle would be high, that my safety was being compromised, but the commitment to justice weighed more. In my darkest moments, I would tell myself that if the deceased man had managed to resist despite threats and fear, I had to do the same. It wasn't just his death. It was his life crying out for justice. One night, after an especially intense day, I received an unexpected visit from a federal investigator who until then had had no direct contact with the case. He brought information that had unlocked doors that seemed sealed forever, documents directly linking a high-ranking public figure to the clandestine operations surrounding the death. It was a conclusive proof we had been missing. The connection between power and crime that explained not only the murder, but the subsequent institutional manipulation. But not all was hopeful. With the report signed and ready to be delivered to the competent authorities, several intimidation attempts intensified. From an attempted hack on my computer to a leak of false information aimed at discrediting my work and reputation. Facing that was not easy. I felt firsthand the dangers of confronting a system that, when threatened, doesn't hesitate to protect itself with claws and teeth. Despite that, I held firm to my conviction, relying on colleagues, friends, and that inner strength born from commitment to an ideal. When the report was finally sent and the forgotten document that triggered everything became the cornerstone of a new formal investigation, I felt a mixture of relief and new unease. I knew it was only the beginning of a long and thorny process, but I also understood that this letter, that small piece of paper, had achieved something that seemed impossible. Changing the course of a story many wanted buried. Now justice held the key to open doors no one else had dared to touch. That experience, beyond professional, left me with a deep lesson and a constant invitation. Never to underestimate the power of a detail, no matter how small it seems, nor the value of those who take the time to listen to what is not said at first glance. If that man, in the midst of fear and despair, had the courage to write that letter, I had to have the strength to make sure his voice was not forgotten. Because in the search for truth, there is a commitment that goes beyond medical knowledge or forensic technique. It is a human commitment, a responsibility that carries the lives that cannot defend themselves. And so, as I close this chapter and continue with other cases, that letter, that story, and that struggle remain etched in my memory as the strongest proof that forensic science not only uncovers death, but can rescue the life trapped within it. That, despite everything, justice always has a chance when someone is willing to look with attentive eyes, listen patiently, and fight wholeheartedly. Because sometimes, just sometimes, a forgotten document can change everything. That night, as I sat in front of my desk, the light barely illuminated the scattered sheets I had accumulated over weeks of tireless investigation. Although it seemed chaotic, every piece of data had its place. Every testimony, no matter how fragmented, began to form a clearer picture of what was really happening. I felt the weight of the truth crushing me, but also a kind of silent relief. For the first time, despite the threats and uncomfortable silences, I held a solid, though dangerous, narrative in my hands. It was not easy to digest all that puzzle, especially because I knew that revealing it would upset powerful people. I remember one night when I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, and the idea of giving up fleetingly crossed my mind. But then I returned to the letter, that forgotten document that had marked the beginning of this journey. In it, the victim not only spoke of threats, they also described names, dates, and even specific places of the meetings where those corrupt networks were woven. A simple fragment that might have seemed like a routine note to others, but to me, it was the most authentic evidence of an uneven fight. I had to be extremely careful when sharing that information. I couldn't trust everyone, even among those who presented themselves as allies. At times, I preferred to proceed cautiously and choose whom to listen to, speaking only with trusted people and always maintaining discretion. The next steps required not only intelligence but also a lot of patience. I knew that rushing things without solid proof could mean losing everything. My job, my integrity, even my life. One night, while reviewing recordings that the driver had provided, something caught my attention. Amid static and background noise, I distinguished a voice barely whispering, frantic, in a fragment that had previously seemed irrelevant. I turned up the volume and mentally translated the words. Trust no one. Everything has a double meaning. The meeting on the 15th is not what it seems. It was a coded message, but enough to give me another lead. I knew I had to act fast. That specified day contained essential information to understand the criminal network I was uncovering. The next day, with that fresh date in mind, I discreetly contacted a colleague specialized in forensic ballistics, a woman who, despite working in a different area, had a valuable network of contacts and experience in these cases. We agreed to meet in a place away from noise and cameras, a dark cafe on a rarely used avenue. There, I presented the hypothesis I was building. Her expression changed from curiosity to concern, and in a low voice, she told me she had heard similar rumors about that meeting, a gathering where a plan was being discussed to secure the control of certain clandestine routes for chemical supplies. According to her, these routes were fundamental to keeping certain organizations operating, and therefore information that if leaked could trigger a domino effect. With that new outlook, the tension only increased. I realized that I was not just facing a homicide case, but a complex operation where political, economic, and social interests converged, far from transparent. The discovery of the letter and the driver's accounts were only the surface. Each finding burdened me with greater responsibility, protecting those who collaborated with me, safeguarding evidence, and above all, maintaining calm under pressure. I knew I was playing a minefield where a wrong step could mean the end. While this was happening, I continued monitoring information on social media and in the press. The journalist who had made noise with the anonymous complaint was pushing harder and harder, but versions began to leak discrediting his work, try and portray the investigation as a setup or a baseless conspiracy. It was a reminder that the enemy did not only operate in dark offices, but also in those invisible spaces where opinions are shaped and public perception manipulated. On several occasions, he contacted me to exchange details, always cautiously, and together we tried to spread the truth without putting sources at risk. At a critical moment, I received an anonymous message through a secure account. An attachment contained financial documents with irregular transactions linking shell companies to the routes where the neurotoxic chemical that killed the victim was transported. What was surprising was a direct connection of these companies with politicians and high-ranking officials. The evidence was far broader and deeper than I had imagined. That night was one of the longest I have ever experienced. I knew the information was crucial and, at the same time, dangerous. I stored everything with extreme caution, and after securing an encrypted backup, planned the next step. But reality hit me hard. Shortly after receiving that information, I noticed strange movements near my house. A car passed by repeatedly, that uncomfortable feeling of being watched, and even a missed call from an unknown number with silence on the other end. I understood that my suspicions about the imminent threat were not paranoia but facts. Still, I did not give in. I armed myself with security protocols, asked for help from loyal friends, and maintained my routine hoping not to show weakness. Vulnerability was present, but conviction was stronger. One day, at the morgue where I always found a space to reflect and briefly rest in the chaos, I had an unexpected encounter with a worker who had been there for years. During casual conversation, she revealed to me that she had seen something on that fateful night that had not been reported. It was something as subtle as strange behavior from some officials entering the evidence area, precisely when bodies were being processed. The curious thing was that this did not appear in any official report, but for someone with experience, it was an indication of tampering. That revelation made me step back to analyze the timeline of the case. Had they tampered with the scene, altered evidence, and tried to erase vital clues? The possibility chilled me, but also gave me a new line of inquiry. I then decided to seek out an expert in electronic security to help me analyze the cameras that supposedly had been sabotaged. His review was a mix of frustration and disbelief. Indeed, several key recordings had been deleted or manipulated, but what caught attention most was a small anomaly in the metadata of the files. It was as if someone had tried to erase digital fingerprints, but had left traces in an encrypted format. This clue became a new puzzle, one that would require special tools to decipher, but that opened the door to identifying the saboteurs. This whole series of discoveries put me in contact with a group of digital forensic specialists, led by an old colleague, who did not hesitate to join the cause. Together, we developed a strategy to protect the integrity of the information while broadening the scope of investigation toward those trying to manipulate evidence. Soon, through secure emails, coded documents, and clandestine meetings, we managed to recover fragments of the mysterious recordings. What they revealed was disturbing. Conversations discussing measures to silence the investigation, exchanges mentioning names of officials and businessmen, and plans to discredit me. Within that group, I felt a mixture of hope and vulnerability. It was a small but committed team, aware of the danger we faced, but also the impact our work could have if we managed to reveal the truth. However, the most unexpected support came from a person who, until then, had preferred to keep a low profile. The victim's family. The wife and children, fearful but determined, approached me with information that complemented what I already knew. Details about threats received days before, sudden changes in the deceased's behavior, and witnesses who had not dared to speak until then. Their courage reaffirmed that my path, despite all the complications, was the right one. The pressure increased, along with the risks. On one occasion, when I least expected it, a phone call shook me with a direct warning. Slow down, Mendez. This could end badly for you. There was no threatening tone, just pure advice disguised as a warning I could not ignore. Nevertheless, I chose to keep going. Every step I took brought me closer to a stronger link between the crime and those spheres of power that wanted to remain hidden behind curtains of opacity. Deep down, I knew I could not advance without the truth, and that truth, precisely because it was hidden, was the one that needed to come to light the most. A day came when the tape I had kept secret, the forgotten document, and all those found testimonies aligned. Everything was ready to take a definitive step, present a powerful report backed by irrefutable evidence. But before doing so, I had to prepare myself for what was coming, for the impact that revelation would cause not only on those handling the case but on society as a whole. I knew it would mark a before and after, that many lives could change, including mine. The impact of that report was as tremendous as I expected, and more. The formal complaint triggered a chain reaction, parallel investigations, dismissals, and at least a series of preliminary arrests. But it also brought barbed wire, invisible barricades, and the constant feeling of walking a tightrope. Justice, although uncertain, grew at least a little in that city that seemed to sleep before corruption. And amid that whirlwind, I understood that my work as a forensic doctor was much more than analyzing bodies. I am a guardian of untold truths, a bridge between what happened and what must be known. Today, looking back, that forgotten document reminds me that in the world of forensic medicine, there is more than science, more than technical precision. There are human stories, personal battles, and a commitment that goes far beyond the laboratory. Because in every body, there is a silence that begs to be heard. In every file, a voice that demands to be revealed. And I, humbly, understood that the patience to discover those voices and the courage to face them are the true tools of the trade. In the pursuit of justice, the smallest detail can become the beacon that illuminates the darkest darkness. And although sometimes the shadows seem stronger, the truth has an unstoppable power, especially when someone dares to see the invisible and listen to what is not said. That was my most valuable lesson and my most revealing story. A case that changed not only the course of the investigation, but also the way I see the world and my role in it. Because in the end, it is not only about finding answers, but about saving the dignity of those who can no longer speak for themselves. And knowing that, despite everything, we are never alone in that fight. What followed after the report presentation far exceeded all my expectations, but not in the way one might hope. The reaction was a whirlwind. On one hand, the appearance of justice began to take hold, with arrests and formal accusations that seemed like the first step toward a new era. But on the other, reluctance and shadows grew stronger. It was as if I'd unleashed an invisible swarm, an army of unseen obstacles conspiring to silence any real progress. I received more veiled threats, documents that disappeared from the files, calls with disconnected lines, and even indirect warnings disguised as casual hallway conversations or calls from so-called concerned friends. Nothing was accidental. Nothing could be ignored. I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just a forensic expert uncovering the truth behind a corpse. I was an active piece on a much larger chessboard, where every move was fraught with traps. I clearly remember one early morning, shortly after the hearing where the recovered evidence was presented. I ended up in a 24-hour cafe, not because I liked cold coffee or the monotonous background music, but because I needed a space to think, to mentally sort fragments without the pressure of the clock or the critical gaze of my colleagues. As I fussed in the chair, shaking my head to rid myself of fatigue, I heard from a distance a couple of voices with accents hard to pinpoint. They were accompanied by a nervous joke, an unhurried chat, until one of them said something that silenced the cafe in my mind. "You think Mendez suspects anything about the swap at the Southern warehouse? If we make him fall there, no one will have to look any further." It was at that moment I realized that not only were they watching my work, but they even had plans to distract me, to make me stumble, to take me away from the seat of truth. That feeling of vulnerability mixed with the relief of knowing that, though invisible, my enemy was there, taking equally cautious steps. From that day on, my routine changed radically, not just because of paranoia, which I cannot deny crept into my nights, but because of the real need to protect the evidence, keep the investigation shielded, and ensure that every piece of that puzzle reached intact hands that could do something with it. I relied even more on my close team and the victim's family, who became more than just witnesses or informants. They were allies in the resistance against imposed silence. But I also learned to be a master of discretion. I knew that every word, every virtual message, and even every gesture was worth its weight in gold and could be intercepted. I resorted to encrypted meetings in unexpected places, coded signals, and even manipulation of codes and digital files to delay or frustrate any attempt at external interference. The story took an unexpected turn when, thanks to a thorough review of leaked financial data, we managed to identify a pattern in economic movements that repeated in exact cycles similar to times when the victim had changed routines or had begun receiving more threats. It was as if someone was tracking him, not just to intimidate, but to prepare a scenario where, for them, the outcome was inevitable. That analysis led us to uncover a network of shell companies spread not only within the city, but also in neighboring states, linked to the same officials who appeared in the original case file. Each of those ghost companies seemed like a node in a web of illegal substance trafficking and money laundering, with the victim caught in the middle, perhaps by his own will or sheer misfortune, but a victim nonetheless. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this case was not an isolated incident. It was the tip of a much larger iceberg, a network extending to levels that made corruption a shadow covering everything, from high-ranking officials to undercover police, and even members of the judicial system itself. That revelation increased the pressure on me in every way. On one side, I felt responsible for protecting the innocent, those who still had a voice, and the few brave souls willing to confront that network. On the other, I knew that every step could cost me not only my career, but also my family's peace and even my own life. Still, I decided there was no turning back. Dignity and the pursuit of justice were worth the risk. The next event was almost surreal. One early morning, I received an unexpected visitor at home. I didn't know whether to open the door or run. In the doorway stood a figure known for discretion, an informant who had remained in the shadows since the beginning of the story. He handed me a manila envelope silently, with only a warning gesture and a watchful eye that spoke louder than any words. Inside was a new document, this time a manuscript with diagrams, names, and dates detailing with heartbreaking precision the operations carried out to corrupt every system in their path. This manuscript, unlike the forgotten original, contained not only information about the victim, but many other cases that until then seemed unrelated. It was a map, a dark atlas of systemic corruption. This discovery ignited a fire inside me. I knew I had to continue, that the only way to protect those risking so much was by exposing every layer of this network and perhaps help dismantle it, even if only through a small crack. I began connecting names and facts, and although paranoia lingered, I started compiling a parallel report with all that new material, hoping that one day it would be used for something other than gathering dust behind a closed door. However, I also realized I shouldn't act alone. We called upon a larger group of trusted specialists, journalists, and lawyers to analyze the scope of all these documents, always with utmost care, and in clandestine meetings that seemed straight out of a spy novel. The tension was palpable. Every minute counted. That small but committed group discovered that several sources who had apparently disappeared or stopped testifying were actually under constant surveillance. We learned of explicit attempts to discredit them, defame their names, and even fracture their families through sophisticated campaigns on social media and influential media outlets. It was a direct attack on those trying to shed light on the truth, an attempt to snuff out any flame before it could become a fire. That reality forced us to rethink our tactics, protect identities, and use every technical and human resource to safeguard not only the information, but also the people behind it. Amid all that chaos, there were moments of absolute humanity. Brief but meaningful encounters where the weight of commitment and courage to keep going was understood without words. The support, although sometimes silent, of the victim's family became a beacon to draw strength from. The trust they placed in me and my team encouraged us to continue, even when everything seemed to be collapsing around us. The feeling that we were on the right path grew stronger, even though the road was full of obstacles, sleepless nights, and chasing shadows that moved too fast. The following months became a race against time, protecting information and evidence, gathering testimonies, decoding codes, and confronting those who sought to sabotage us. The unit we formed achieved crucial moments. We uncovered links between certain officials we believed untouchable, exposing their hidden agendas, confirmed the participation of businessmen pulling strings behind the scenes, and above all, understood that fear was the first enemy to defeat if we wanted the truth to finally come to light. Yes, we were victims of sabotage, deliberate leaks intended to sow doubt, and even personal attacks against me. But we also witnessed the strength of commitment, solidarity, and conviction that could move mountains even under the constant threat of collapse. With each new step, the shadows seemed to recede bit by bit, and although justice was still a distant ideal, the feeling of initiating something that would transcend far beyond the individual case became present. That inner change, that certainty that behind every body I examine, every file I review, there's more than a death. There are lives, stories, and an apparent collective desire for truth marked me forever. Because I understood that the forensic doctor is not just an interpreter of scientific facts, but a storyteller and a silent hero in the search for real justice, even when it is the hardest to achieve. And then I knew that no matter the dark nights, the present threats, or the apparent solitude, the truth will always find a way. That forgotten document at the beginning had not only changed the case, but also my destiny and the course of those who believed enough in justice to step forward. And although many shadows remain to be illuminated, I know that as long as there is someone willing to listen, observe, and dare to tell the invisible, justice will not be as far away as it seems. Because, in the end, it is not just about corpses or files, but about rescuing human dignity from eternal silence. And that is the deepest struggle I've faced, and probably the one I will always face. But it is also what gives me, every day, a reason to stand tall. The breath of danger became a constant presence, like a shadow curling up in every corner of my daily life, invisible but persistent. As we unraveled the tangled web we had discovered, the structure of harmful power became clearer, but also more impatient, because with each of our advances, they seemed to lose ground while the temperature in the environment rose. We received coded messages from anonymous sources. Occasional false leaks threatened to discredit our work and, with it, sow doubt in public opinion. But the most unsettling thing was not those explicit tactics, but the silences that hinted at how deeply rooted the corruption was, touching even those who swore to protect justice. These were moments when the line between friend and enemy blurred, and trust became as scarce as it was valuable. I couldn't help but let paranoia accompany me during those long nights, when a reflection of city lights slipped through the window, and every noise seemed to mark the accelerated pulse of a hidden enemy. It was during those hours that I reviewed over and over each document, each testimony, searching for the slightest clue that would allow us to anticipate the moves of those who wanted to stop us. We were not only pursuers of the truth, but also destined to be pursued by it. However, we were not alone. My team, small but unwaveringly loyal, became my anchor, reasoning with me when fear tried to take hold, reminded me that giving up now would break the last tie that bound us to hope. What no one expected was the appearance of an unexpected figure, someone who until then had remained in the shadows but decided to step forward, risking everything to reveal data that would shake more than economic or political structures. Fernando, a man from the inner circle of several of the implicated, whose conscience seemed to weigh on him more than any threat. His confessions came in a handful of clandestine meetings in a nearly vanished city park, where we looked at each other like two strangers crossing an abyss. The information he brought left us breathless. He spoke of secret meetings, quotas paid in blood, veiled threats exchanged for silence, and a network so vast it seemed woven not only with political and financial interests, but with the complicity of men and women in power. Fernando had nothing to gain, carrying only the need for the truth to come to light, even if that meant losing everything. His information led us to a new investigation into a series of disappearances that had been shelved without further explanation. Victims who, we now understood, had tried to break the cycle or simply knew too much. Each name uncovered a pain that could almost be felt in the air when we gathered to cross-check information. The opacity with which those cases were silenced spoke of a systematic strategy to make disappear not only the people, but also the possibility of justice. The pressure became unbearable, stronger, more direct, and the line separating the search for truth from the fight for survival became thin, almost imperceptible. But there was no turning back. With each leap we took, the network was stripped bare and our certainty grew. We knew when and where the next moves were planned. Deduce who sat all the tables of power, and understood that decisions that seemed distant affected real lives. Even more, there was an aspect that shook us. The victim, the origin of all this chaos, had been much more than a pawn on that board. They had tried to play by their own rules, attempting to protect what they loved, leaving traces that only someone willing to look patiently and without prejudice could find. That became the key to connecting dots, to understanding that the forgotten document at the beginning was no coincidence, but a warning no one wanted to hear until that moment. Amid that whirlwind of analysis, encrypted emails, and secret meetings, ominous signals began arriving from within the institution where I worked. Attempts to discredit my work, moves to transfer or relegate me positions without access to sensitive cases, veiled pressures disguised as bureaucracy aimed at wearing me down until my voice was silenced. But each attempt was met with the same determination, because I now understood this was a battle that transcended the forensic doctor I had been until then. It was a commitment to the dignity and memory of those lives that had been trampled, but also a fight against the structures that allowed evil to hide behind official seals and institutional cover-ups. During one of those days when fatigue seemed ready to defeat me, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end of the phone was barely a whisper, trembling but urgent. "Dr. Mendez, it's not safe to talk here. I'm leaving you a message when you can use your secure email. Check the address I will send you." I hung up with my heart in my throat. Minutes later, among endless lists of codes and digital signatures, a new file appeared. An encrypted recording, dark, poor quality, but with a testimony I could not ignore. A voice from someone very close to one of the implicated, confessing under the pressure of guilt and fear, detailing steps, names, and methods that confirmed the network, but also pointed to unknown culprits to us. That revelation was a powerful blow that made my team and me organize an urgent meeting, one of those held wrapped in certainty that every word could be intercepted, and that time, once again, was more enemy than ally. In that meeting, we went one step further. We established links with international organizations and activists committed to exposing organized crime and corruption, not because we thought they would act quickly, but to create a network of protection, visibility that made it much harder for those responsible to continue operating with impunity. As we advanced in this new alliance, we received information that an important witness, key to deciphering and linking all the data we collected, was in danger. He himself asked us for help to leave the country, aware that his life was on the line. It was a difficult decision, full of doubts and fears, to accept and facilitate that protection. But I understood that the bravest act at that moment was to preserve that living testimony above any protocol. While coordinating his exit, the attacks increased in intensity and ingenuity. Digital attacks tried to erase crucial files. Sabotage of equipment slowed our work. And a discredit campaign even questioned my professional and personal integrity. Each dawn was a battle won only to face another, and little by little I understood that the fight was not only against individuals, but against a system that needed hunger and feared to sustain itself. However, solidarity became a shield. We received anonymous letters of support from ordinary people who, even without knowing the details, clung to the hope we tried to hold with every step we took. Messages from the victim's family became a sacred reminder of the purpose driving us, reminding us that behind all this web of interests, there was someone who truly deserved justice. One night, when exhaustion seemed to nest in my bones, an unexpected new twist shook everything. While reviewing a seemingly routine document, I noticed a tiny discrepancy in the recorded dates. That simple observation led me to investigate more deeply, and then we discovered that someone had manipulated official records to hide not only key evidence, but people involved who should have been investigated. That manipulation forged from within the judicial system was perhaps the most devastating betrayal, because it meant that even if we broke the siege from outside, the very mechanism responsible for delivering justice was being sabotaged to protect the guilty. It was a heartbreaking revelation, but also a call to redouble efforts. I then understood that my work would be eternal, because it was not enough to uncover the truth once, but to keep it standing against the assaults of those who wanted to bury it. Amid those hectic weeks, a small victory lit the way. One of the officials we thought untouchable was removed from office, thanks to the evidence we had managed to gather and present with surgical precision. It was not the end of the road, not even close, but his fall meant that resistance to justice had been vulnerable for the first time in a long time. It was a victory that gave courage to those of us in the middle of that storm, a clear message that, under the right pressure and a union of honest forces, the truth could open breaches in the deepest darkness. But that victory also served to remind us how fragile everything is when built on fear and silence. Threats grew, and with them, the certainty that although justice could go further, the cost would be high for everyone. I received unexpected visits from authorities who disguised good intentions, but were part of the corrupt fabric we needed to unmask. Those were tense moments where diplomacy and firmness had to meet without losing sight of the ultimate goal, protecting the truth. Looking back and reflecting on the journey that began with that forgotten document, I cannot help but feel a mix of exhaustion and hope. I know it was not in vain, that every sacrifice helped bring about changes that, though small, were signs that the system could be broken and shaped into something fairer. But I also know the road is long, and that in these processes victories come at the cost of effort and the price of never resting on one's laurels. Still, I embraced that path because I understood that my real role is not just to uncover the truth behind the death, but to keep alive that spark that guards human dignity, even when the night seems endless. And while I write these lines, certain there will be new challenges, new shadows to expose, I find renewed strength in these words, because I know that even in the deepest silence, the truth whispers, and those who seek it honestly will always find a light to keep moving forward. The key is to never give up, to be patient like time and tenacious like memory. No matter how many try to hide it, the truth, in the end, always finds a way, a megaphone, and, above all, a heart that refuses to be silenced. The following weeks were a web of shadows that thickened with each new piece of information, as if someone wanted to wrap us in a permanent fog to make us lose all contact with reality. But it was not the external darkness that affected us the most, but the growing certainty that this network of corruption and violence was not limited to a few, but was sown in many corners, so deeply that moving one piece dragged many others along. It was like when you remove a piece from a huge tapestry, and the edges begin to unravel, showing that it all rested on threads that were fragile yet essential at the same time. That forgotten document was, at the start, the trigger that set off this unstoppable cascade of revelations, but the real test was maintaining the pace, and not losing calm when what we discovered challenged us at every moment. There were names that at first seemed too big to be true, figures so established in power that merely mentioning them out loud felt like an act of recklessness. However, the facts spoke, and as we cross-referenced testimonies, images, dates, and places, the truth became undeniable. What struck me the most was understanding how effective small omissions, calculated silences, and subtle manipulations can be, which together form a stormy sea where those who swim honestly always run the risk of drowning. I clearly remember an especially tense afternoon when we were in the lab reviewing forensic evidence that seemed unrelated to the case. However, suddenly, a minor discrepancy in a toxicological analysis led us to discover that several samples had been swapped shortly before the perpetrators made their final move. That meant someone inside the team, perhaps from within the institution itself, was trying to protect the culprits, sabotaging from within. It was a revelation that for a moment made me question whether it was all worth it, whether the fight against so much corruption could really be won. But then I looked at my team, and their resolve, their silent commitment, was a fuel that pushed me to keep going without hesitation. There were nights when the tension was palpable even in the air, like an indescribable pressure that we could neither release with sleep nor with the passing hours. On those occasions, whispered conversations, knowing glances, and subtle gestures were our way of resisting. We couldn't show vulnerability, because that was the space where the enemy struck hardest. Still, the humanity of the team showed itself when we least expected it. A coffee shared beside the case files, a joke that momentarily broke the silence, or simply a gesture of encouragement when doubt crept too close. The hardest part was realizing that this fight had a cost not only professionally but also personally. The threats we had received were not empty, nor were they just to intimidate. They were designed to break us, to make us abandon this battle before the truth was within reach. One night, I found an anonymous note on my doorstep with a simple but cruel message. Some sacrifices are not worth it. I couldn't sleep for hours, thinking about what that message meant for my family, for my children who still didn't understand why Dad arrived so tired and reserved. But I knew the only way to protect them was not to give in. The appearance of Fernando, our unexpected witness, continued to be a fundamental pillar, but even he had his shadows. His changing attitude, prolonged silences, and constant fear reminded us of the vulnerability of all involved. There was a particularly delicate moment when we received a message warning that he was being followed. We were forced to reorganize everything to extract him from the city and provide him a safe place. For me, that transfer was one of the tensest silent operations I have ever experienced, because every small mistake could cost lives and the end of everything. However, when I saw him arrive safe and sound to Agreed Place, I felt such profound relief that I believed that moment was a small victory against the shadow that stalked us. But trust was a scarce commodity. We discovered that some people of faith within the institution played for both sides. They protected some while cautiously monitoring our moves, silently passing information to those who wanted to maintain the status quo. That caused many sleepless nights, wondering who I could trust, even within my own team. Loyalty was a minefield, and every step had to be carefully calculated not to fall into hidden traps. More than once, we had to delay progress or change strategy simply to protect those we believed deserved to be on our side. One scene I cannot forget happened when a close colleague called him to say he had found a secret digital backup with files confirming the direct involvement of several authorities. But the price for sharing that information was high. The colleague disappeared for weeks without leaving a trace. When he reappeared, his life had changed forever. That episode marked me deeply because it showed that corruption not only devours the present, but also feeds a machine of terror that intimidates even the best among us. And in the midst of that sea of difficulties, the forgotten document kept shining like an accidental beacon, tireless in its revelation. I myself reread it so as not to miss any detail, understand that behind every word, every date, there was a truth someone had deliberately tried to silence. That note contained a coded message, almost imperceptible, but once deciphered, it allowed us to connect threads that until then seemed loose. It was like assembling a puzzle with pieces we had long ignored, because they were camouflaged among papers no one wanted to review calmly. By unraveling that code, we came across a series of documents that explained not only the mechanism of corruption, but also its hidden motivations. A system that sacrificed lives for profit, used families as a bargaining chip, and manipulated the law like one moves pieces on a board for their exclusive benefit. We understood that this violence was not only the result of selfish ambitions, but part of a structure where fear and complicity were the invisible rules that dominated the game. As the tension escalated, we received support from all sides, even through unconventional channels. Encrypted messages arrived with data we didn't know existed, videos showing secret meetings, recordings unmasking figures until then untouchable. But that avalanche of information, while empowering, also plunged us into unbearable weariness. The certainty that each file, each testimony, could be minutes away from disappearing again or being manipulated weighed on us all. It was a battle against a hydra that, when one head was cut off, two more emerged, each more promising and more dangerous. Still, our conviction remained firm. I often heard my team quietly asking how it was possible that people still decided to raise their voices when silence seemed the safest option. But that solidarity, that human spark that brought light amid endless nights, was the engine that drove us forward. We could not fail them because behind each file were real stories, people who depended on their names not being lost to oblivion. One of the most critical moments came when, in a new review, we found essential electronic evidence had disappeared, evidence needed to dismantle the network. It was a hard blow. It seemed all progress vanished in an instant. We locked ourselves in for hours, trying to recover residual copies, tracing every bit that could save us. The atmosphere in the lab was dense, whispers, tired looks, and a silence only broken by the desperate tapping of keys. Finally, thanks to a clever recovery method, we managed to retrieve essential fragments. That small victory reminded us that even amid chaos, patience and determination can find those cracks through which light seeps. That day ended with a bittersweet feeling. There was hope, but the battle was just beginning. The enemies continued lurking, and we knew every step forward was also a risk. But it was a reality we had to accept. More than being afraid, I decided fear should be the flame that protected our conviction, not the fire that consumed it. Some nights, in the solitude of my office, I stopped to think about what had become the victim in all this web. It was not just another case. It was the tip of the iceberg that uncovered all that corruption. I remembered details, his face in images, scattered notes, and that silent with that exuded resistance. I then understood that his fight had not been in vain, and that every step we took was also a tribute to that brave attempt to seek justice amid abandonment. I cannot deny that the emotional and physical burden was heavy, that there were moments when despair wanted to take over me. But in those very moments, the memory of the initial words kept me alert. The bodies and their records can always teach something new. It was a constant reminder that every detail, no matter how small, had the power to change everything if one was willing to look with patience and without prejudice. Moreover, the experience taught me that truth is not a smooth line, but a path full of curves where every turn can surprise, frighten, or illuminate. That is why commitment could not be only to a concrete result, but to the search itself, with the conviction that, although the night is endless, there is always a light breaking through the deepest silence. In the final moments of an endless day, when we managed to find a thread to keep moving forward, I felt the weight of responsibility grow, but also that our voice became stronger, more solid. That balance between fear and hope was the secret to not breaking. And although it was clear the road would be long, with challenges we could not yet measure, I knew I was not alone. My team, every person committed to the truth, and the very memory of the victim formed a network stronger than any attempt at concealment. That is why, now that I write these lines, I understand that forgotten document not only changed the course of case, but marked a turning point in my professional and personal life. It taught me, in the harshest way, that the pursuit of justice is also a bet on resilience, patience, and integrity in the face of the darkest corruption. It showed me that there are shadows that seem invincible, but that with perseverance and support can be illuminated, even if only a little. Ultimately, truth is not just a fact or a datum. It is an act of silent courage. And although the path continues today, with new challenges imposed by justice and duty, I am certain that this essence can never be lost. Because the fight that began with a simple lost document is, in reality, much greater. It is a commitment to life itself, to the dignity that no corrupt power should ever trample. And that lesson, that truth, is a legacy I carry with me in every step I take, in every body I examine, in every name I remember. Because, in the end, What really matters is that the truth finds those it wants and never, ever abandons them. What came after that moment was a chain of events that, although it seemed almost unbearable, taught me not to take anything for granted and to value even the smallest clues. Each new discovery carried a heavier weight, yet also sparked a small flame of hope. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was much darker and more complex than we had imagined at first. The ramifications of that corrupt network unfolded with almost cruel precision, manifesting in the shadows, in forced silences, and in corners where no one dared to look. I remember that one of the most devastating pieces of evidence was not a technical report, nor the Gray's result of a laboratory, but the silent testimony of the documents we managed to recover. Among them were almost forgotten photographs of meetings, incomplete signatures on contracts, and emails that, when read carefully and with attention, told a hidden story behind all the violence that until then we had attributed only to criminal problems. It was as if those papers were a mirror, reflecting not only corruption but also the indifference of those who, through neglect or complicity, allowed the system to rot from within, an understanding that hurt me more than any other revelation. Little by little, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a picture where the victims were not only those who appear at crime scenes, but also those who, forced by fear or ignorance, remained silent, trapped in a web of interest that did not include them. We discovered that the violence was more organized and systematic than we seemed willing to accept, and that certainty not only put us at risk, but also increased the urgency to uncover the truth, even though with each step forward we felt how the shadow of power tried to block our way. There was a crucial moment when we received a call with information that seemed impossible to verify. They said there was an unexpected witness, someone with direct access to the top of that criminal network, and who was willing to cooperate. That contact was both a blessing and a source of concern. The witness, Fernando, came into our lives almost surprisingly and showed us that behind appearances there were cracks through which we could begin to enter. But the danger was real and constant. Every step we took made it tangible. Exposure was inevitable, and with it the need to take extreme measures to protect not only the witness's integrity, but also our own. What for many would have been a reason to step back, to reconsider whether it was worth continuing, became for me and my team an unstoppable driver. The trust placed in Fernando was not simply a professional matter. It was a human commitment. We knew that the word of a single person could be the seed to dismantle a structure that seemed invulnerable. But again, the fight was not only on a logical path of evidence and documents. It was a battle both psychological and physical. We lived with the constant feeling that we were being watched, that every move could be the last, that forced us to double our efforts, to carefully guard the details that might seem insignificant at first glance. On one of the tensest days, while reviewing recordings that Fernando had given us, we saw how an apparently harmless meeting between public officials and businessmen hid an explicit agreement for influence peddling. It was a moment that left me breathless, not only because of the importance of the material, but because it confirmed that we were treading on ground that could affect much more than our case. That recording was a window into a world where the distribution of power was based on fear, manipulation, and impunity. And yet, faced with that devastating truth, I did not allow myself to lose perspective. I knew that was just the prelude to a much greater battle. Within the team, the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Some colleagues, who had been firm from the beginning, began to show signs of emotional and physical exhaustion. Sleepless nights, constant surveillance, and understandable paranoia were starting to exact a price. But it was also during those moments that our solidarity shone brightest. We became a family united not only by a goal, but by the simple need to support one another. A hug in the hallway, a message of encouragement, or a brief meeting to share a breath became vital acts to keep going. It was then that I understood we were not fighting this war alone, but with the strength and heart of all those who believed in justice, even if only in silence. In the midst of that storm, the enemy did not remain still. Several times they tried to infiltrate our circle and sabotage plans from within. The moment we discovered that some essential electronic evidence had gone missing caused one of the deepest pains. That temporary loss made us feel more vulnerable than ever. The feeling that everything could vanish in an instant was terrifying. However, the response was not to give up. We spent hours, days, tracking loose ends, searching every folder, every fleeting backup for a trace that would allow us to recover the truth. And when we finally managed to rescue vital fragments, the relief was immediate, but it also reminded us how close we were to the abyss. The path pushed us to decipher every hidden message, every symbol concealed in those old documents. It was like reading between the lines what was never meant to be said, and understanding that corruption was not only based on illegal acts, but on a toxic culture that, over time, had normalized violence and abandonment of the most vulnerable. And that revelation was, in turn, an enormous threat to those who held power. There was no room for mistakes or faltering, because the machinery to protect itself was ruthless and always found a way to adapt. We had to learn to move quickly, change tactics, and always think several steps ahead. Personal threats stopped being a whisper and became a constant pulse in our daily lives. I remember how on more than one occasion I arrived home with the feeling of having left something unfinished, or with a lump in my throat seeing the worried faces of my children who still did not understand the magnitude of the danger. But they also taught me a lot about the strong and silent love of those who awaited my return. That reality forced me to balance risks, to be a strategist not only inside the laboratory but in my own life, because I understood that the battle was wide-ranging and that protection was part of our resistance. One of the scenes that stayed with me was when, during Fernando's transfer to a safe place, tension took hold of all of us. Every step had to be calculated, every movement invisible to those who had been following us for hours. The journey seemed endless, and in the silence only the rapid beats of uncertainty could be heard. But then, seeing him arrive safe and sound, I felt a mix of relief and gratitude rarely experienced in my life. That moment was further proof that, although the danger was real and constant, hope could sustain us and make the fight worthwhile. Alongside these efforts, signals began arriving from unexpected places. Through discreet means, people who also wanted the truth to come to light sent us crucial information, recordings, photographs, documents that together formed an increasingly clear map of who the real culprits were. But that avalanche of data was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it strengthened us, gave us a sense of progress, but on the other, it plunged us into an almost unbearable exhaustion, because we knew that every file had to be examined with precision, and that any mistake could leave us vulnerable or erase those traces forever. The paradox of that situation was that the very information that could save us could also be used against us. The corruption network was prepared to defend its interests tooth and nail, and although we tried to take cautious steps, we could never be completely sure who was with us and who betrayed us. That uncertainty was perhaps one of the greatest internal enemies. It showed us that loyalty is as valuable as it is fragile, and that trust must be earned day by day, with small but concrete acts. However, despite the wounds, losses, and endless nights, we never stopped moving forward. The search became a greater call, a kind of commitment that transcended the professional. There were real stories there, wounded families, lives that depended on our work. Knowing that our efforts could make a difference kept us strong, even knowing the cost would be high. Every step we took was a silent way to honor those who had been silenced, to build a path for those who could still be saved. And perhaps the greatest revelation came at the end, when we understood that the forgotten document was much more than a key piece in a file. It was a symbol of something much deeper, the certainty that the truth is there, hidden in the details no one expects, in the shadows that resist being illuminated, that justice, although slow and sometimes frustrating, is possible when integrity prevails, and when there are those who refuse to be accomplices to silence, that bodies with their records, their secrets, always speak to us, even when everything seems lost. Sitting now, rereading that forgotten note, I think about how something so small could trigger a chain that tore the veil of impunity. And although the journey continues, still full of uncertainties, one certainty accompanies me. Truth is not only sought, but built with courage, patience, and the unwavering conviction that, in the end, it is the only legacy that can uphold human dignity against any shadow. Because, after all, it is that light, however faint, that never goes out and always finds those who deserve it. That day when we cross a line, when we decided we could no longer remain in the comfort of silence, things truly began to change. It was not a moment of euphoria nor an explosion of certainties, but rather a slow yet firm fall into an abyss of bitter and raw reality. I remember that after that clandestine meeting, We stepped into the hallway with the feeling that we had become pieces in a much larger game, and that our actions would start to provoke echoes we never imagined. It was then that I understood that fear was stalking not only us but everyone who, in one way or another, was involved. Somehow, we became both prey and hunters at the same time, aware that every piece of information we unearthed could be the last domino to fall, but also a shot in the leg for those trying to stop us. The nights grew longer. The silence of the early morning was filled not only with exhaustion, but with the tension that comes from knowing that outside, in the shadows, someone was watching your every step. In those moments, we could not afford to lower our guard, not even for an instant. Those who entered our workspace at the most unexpected hours were no longer just colleagues or part of the daily routine, but potential bearers of good news or veiled threats. The streets of Guadalajara, which until then seemed familiar and peaceful to me, became a silent enemy, with corners that seemed to quietly applaud the dark dance of power behind the scenes. As we dug deeper, we also saw how corruption had taken root in the most unexpected places. It was not just political power or shady businesses. That network infected everything from public offices to small private enterprises, and from there to the labyrinths of the least traveled streets. Violence, which I had previously thought of as something spontaneous or a product of common crime, now revealed itself as a structured beast fed by interests beyond the tangible. It was a monster that fed on despair, complicity in silence, and social indifference. And it was that understanding that made me never see my work, nor my colleagues, the same way again. Fernando's arrival was a turning point. He was not just a witness, but a critical link, almost a key that began to open doors locked for years. But with his presence came deeper fears. Every time we received information from him, the question was how to protect him, how to protect ourselves. In a world where corrupted power sees every human as an enemy, Fernando's life was more delicate than anyone's. We were forced to become shadows, to disguise strategies, to build invisible walls around our daily existence. And though we knew nothing would be completely safe, the hope his testimony gave us was stronger than any risk. And it was in that mix of paranoia and hope that the recording appeared. That evidence, when shown on the screen before our team, was like a punch straight to the stomach. Watching those officials and businessmen exchange knowing glances, speaking with calculated coldness, brought the brutal reality back to us. We were facing not only visible criminals, but architects a system full of cracks, where violence was just another symptom. It was written on their faces, in their gestures, in every word they said so naturally. We understood that to dismantle something like this, proof was not enough. We needed courage, patience, and above all, the conviction that no pressure, threat, or attack could break us. The following weeks were an emotional whirlwind. Some of my colleagues endured it heroically. Others, more fragile or exhausted, began to yield under the pressure. It was not uncommon to see some withdraw, as the memory of those calm and normal days seemed like a distant mirage. But what stayed engraved in my soul was that within that exhaustion a new strength was born, an invincible solidarity. Those small gestures that seemed insignificant, a word of encouragement, a midnight coffee, a shoulder to cry on, became the foundations of resistance that turned almost sacred. It was there I understood that true courage did not lie solely in the evidence we gathered, but in the human bond that kept us standing. Although it may seem counterintuitive, the reality was that as we advanced, the danger became more tangible, even physical. Infiltration, sabotage, temporary disappearances of crucial evidence. It all combined to make us feel as if the ground was shifting beneath our feet. There were moments when I felt everything could collapse, that the truth would evaporate with the next anonymous threat or dirty maneuver. But it didn't. The resistance not only survived, but was reborn stronger, more determined to find fragments of truth in the darkness. Then came the night when we managed to recover some of those discarded pieces of evidence. The silent joy within the team was an unforgettable memory for me. The mix of fatigue and triumph that only those who have survived a storm can understand. For a moment, the pieces fit again, the invisible network became tangible, and the path seemed less tortuous. But we didn't get distracted. We knew each step forward was also a call to be more alert, to know that behind that victory lurked a stronger blow. While deciphering those messages, those traces left unintentionally, I realized that what we were seeing was not simply a case of corruption, but a cruel mirror of what happens when power becomes an end in itself. And that toxic culture, invisible to many, was making an entire society sick. It was then I knew the real fight was not only against those committing illegal acts, but against systematic indifference, against the apathy that made us indirect accomplices. I understood that our work, our struggle, was far more important than I thought. It was about giving people back not only the truth, but also the hope that they could live in a different world. With threats growing, the tension in the team increased as well. I remember coming home and seeing unspoken questions in my children's eyes, of fear they still didn't know how to name. That hurt me deeply, but also made me realize I couldn't fail them. The battle was much bigger than me, bigger than all of us. In that fragile balance between vocation and human frailty, I found a new strength. From that moment on, we were defending not only justice, but also the silent love that gave us the courage to carry on. The scene of Fernando's transfer remains in my memory as a moment suspended in time. Every movement was a racing heartbeat, every second a hell breath. The danger was so real, so present. It seemed to take on a form of its own, dark and threatening. But when I finally saw him arrive safe, with an exhausted but hopeful expression, I felt all the effort had been worth it. It was one of those moments when gratitude, relief, and determination blend into an unforgettable mixture. There, I understood that we were in this together, that as long as there was a person willing to speak and us willing to listen, the truth would have a chance. From that moment, doors started opening in unexpected ways. Messages, calls, files arriving as small anonymous gifts became essential pieces to dismantle that dark network. But this avalanche of information brought its own battle, one of focused endurance. Every document had to be examined, as if it were the last, because in any one of them could lie the definitive key or the trap that would make us fall. The double-edged nature of the situation kept us on a constant thread between hope and fear. Paranoia became a companion of every day, suspicion a shadow infiltrating even the most trivial details. We learned that trust is a scarce resource, that the enemy might be closer than it seems. We also discovered that loyalty, when genuine, is an irreplaceable strength. And amid that uncertainty, the team grew stronger, more united, better prepared for whatever came. This experience changed me not only as a professional, but as a person, because I saw how all of us, each in our own way, fought not only for justice, but to keep dignity intact in the face of darkness. Every loss, every sleepless night, every threat became scars that told a bigger story, a story about the importance of not giving up, of continuing to seek, of looking for light even in the darkest corners. I finally understood that the forgotten document, that small fragment that changed everything, was more than a mere paper. It was a silent call, a reminder that the truth is there, waiting for someone to find and defend it. And although the journey does not end here, that certainly has become the beacon guiding every step. Returning to that paper, rereading it calmly, and knowing what it unleashed fills me with a mixture of humility and responsibility. Because now I know justice is not a result, but an endless process. That truth is not easily found nor delivered without cost. That integrity, patience, and courage are the only weapons with which we can endure. And that even if darkness seems impenetrable, there is always a light that breaks through, because someone decided not to wait for another to do it. That light, no matter how faint, is the one that never dies and the one always worth pursuing.